The following story is entirely fictional. Any resemblance of characters or events to real world events is purely coincidental. The story begins when a group of college friends and I decided that we were going to go to Europe. Initially, I was hesitant at first as I had never traveled before, but they convinced me and, well, we went. My friend Jamie had an aunt and an uncle who lived in Germany, and they said that we were more than welcome to come and stay with them for a while we were there on our travels. So we decided to start our journey in Germany. So we left on a Friday night, packed all our things, got on our plane, and we were off. Upon arrival in Germany, we were warmly welcomed by Jamie's aunt and uncle. They took our bags and we got in their car, and it was quite a long trip to get to their house. They lived in the countryside and not anywhere near the city, but where they lived was really quaint and beautiful, quite a peaceful and serene atmosphere. We stayed with Jamie's aunt and uncle for a few days, but after a while we started to get a bit restless and wanted to move on and do more. I mean, it was great and peaceful in the countryside, but we wanted more of a challenge. So we informed Jamie's aunt and uncle that we were leaving to head to our next destination. But before we left, they suggested that we do one thing before leaving. They said that there was a popular camping spot about 3 hours hike north of where they lived, and Jamie's uncle said that he and his father and his grandfather and his father always used to do this as a tradition in the family, and he suggested that Jamie do it as well with his friends so that maybe he'd get a sense of enjoyment and fulfillment in knowing that he actually did something while we were in Germany. Honestly, at this point, Jamie just wanted to leave, but after we sat down and had a think about it, we thought, okay, you know what, let's just do it. So we got all our bags, we got everything. Jamie's uncle gave us a few things that we would need for camping, including a tent because we didn't know that we were going to be camping. So he told us to hike north for 3 hours until we got to the camping spot. It's in the mountains, it's in a basically secluded area with trees, but he assured us that we would be safe there. Before our departure for the campsite, Jamie's uncle gave us three important rules to remember. He told us to always stay close to the river that was running through the mountains, never go out alone into the woods at night, and to stay close to your campsite. And for some reason, he told us, do not talk to any strangers. And we were thinking, it's a secluded spot. Who are we going to talk to? So we just laughed it off and we were off. We decided to embark on the hike, and I must say, it was a tedious and tiresome hike. We were absolutely exhausted by the time we get there. And the fact that we had to stay there for 3 nights, but we decided to soldier through. So we found a camping spot right next to the river actually. It was quite convenient. So as we got to the campsite, we set up the tent, which proved to be quite a difficult task since none of us had ever done that before. But hey, with the teamwork, we made the dream work and we managed to set up the tent. Jamie then had the brilliant idea to take a stroll through the woods just to clear his mind. We told him that we had just come from a 3 hour stroll, or a hike as they call it. So why on earth did he need to go and walk more? He said no, that he wanted a bit of a sense of adventure. So we persuaded him to stay behind, and eventually he listened. And we then decided to do some fishing, start a fire, and get supper ready because it was already getting dark. And we used the fishing poles that Jamie's uncle had given us, but proved quite an impossible task to catch fish. But by some measure of a miracle, we managed to actually catch one small fish. It was the highlight of our day because we were so excited for just catching that one little fish. We then ate our little fish. We had to share the portions between us. There were about four of us. And once we ate, we laid under the stars and we just looked up at the stars and just spoke about all the memories that we had from our days at college and what we were still going to do and what we were going to do when we were done. And then it came time to sleep. We were all incredibly tired from our 3 hour hike. And so we all got our sleeping bags out, and instead of actually sleeping inside the tent, we decided to lay our sleeping bags side by side in front of the tent, and we all fell asleep. I was then woken by a howling wind, a cold, crisp, icy, howly wind that seemed to kiss my cheek and wake me up. I sat up in my sleeping bag and I looked to my left and to my right, and the other sleeping bags were empty. I thought that everyone else had gone back into the tent and slept there and left me outside. So I went over to the tent, unzipped it, opened it, and looked, and it was empty. I called around for everyone else, but there was no reply. So I grabbed a flashlight and I noticed footprints leading into the forest. So I switched the flashlight on and I followed the footprints. I felt really uneasy because, a city slicker like me, just walking through the forest, and it was the first time that had been in that type of environment. I'd never really been camping before. So I treaded really slowly and really carefully. And every single little sound, every twig that I stepped on, every bird that made a noise in the trees startled me. I was like spinning around, just looking at everything and looking everywhere, shining my flashlight everywhere, scaring a few small animals away in the process. I walked for honestly what seemed like hours, like minutes became hours, and eventually I didn't know where I was anymore. I looked behind me and I didn't see the footprints that I was following. I looked in front of me and there were no more footprints. And I don't know how I strayed from the path, because there was a straight path and I was walking along that path. But when I turned around to go back, it was like I was in a completely different place. So as I was walking back, I heard familiar voices. I heard all my friends' voices, but it was coming from inside somewhere. So when I kept walking and peered around a tree, I saw a cabin and the lights were on, and I heard my friends' laughter and talking coming from inside the cabin. So I approached the cabin naturally. I knocked on the door, and a kindly old man with a smile answered the door and asked if I was okay, if everything was fine. So I said no, I was kind of lost in the woods because I was camping with my friends, and I basically told him the whole story and that I was now lost. And he invited me in, and I was really confused because he invited me and it was only him and his wife. He introduced himself as Norman and his wife as Petunia. They invited me to sit down in the dining room and offered me something to eat and some tea. I declined and said that I'm just looking for my friends. I heard their laughter coming from inside your cabin. And they looked at me confused and said, "No, it's just been them too. There's no one else in the cabin." I then thought to excuse myself because, I was lost, but I needed to find my friends. And I was hoping that maybe they could give me directions for where exactly I was in the forest. And they just looked at me and said, "Please stay for tea." And I felt really bad that I couldn't, but, at the end of the day, we had just had our little fish and I was tired and I was just looking for my friends. So I said for a second time, sorry, I can't stay for tea. I really, really need to look for my friends. And they just kept staring at me and they repeated the phrase, "Please stay for tea." I then uttered a third time that, no, I apologize. I'm sorry. I really cannot stay for tea. I really have to go and look for my friends. I have to find where they are. And for a third time, they looked at me dead in my eye and said, "Please stay for tea," all while having a blank smile on their faces. It was almost as if they didn't really hear me or hear what I was saying, because every time that I said that I needed to leave, they would utter the same phrase, "Please stay for tea." At this point, I felt an uncanny discomfort in just being there. The whole atmosphere seemed so comforting, so warm, so inviting, yet so eerie. But I decided to oblige and I stayed for tea. They made me a cup of tea and it was rather sweet, and they were having a jolly conversation with me sitting and laughing around the table. But then minutes turned to hours, and before you know it, everything just went dark. I was then shaken awake and someone tapped on my shoulder, and I woke up and noticed that I had fallen asleep with my head on the table. But when I looked around the cabin, it wasn't the same as it was the night before, because now it was the next morning. And I looked to my left and my friends were standing there and they looked really concerned. They said that we had all gone to sleep the night before, and when they woke up in the middle of the night, I wasn't there. And I had explained to them that that's what happened to me, and then that's when I got lost. I then explained to them the whole situation and the whole story, and my friend Jamie looked at me surprised. And that's when I looked down around at the cabin and noticed that everything was dilapidated and abandoned. And I looked on the table. There were 3 cups of tea, but it wasn't filled with tea, it was filled with what looked like swamp water. One cup on either side of the table, and then one cup in front of me. But when I looked nicely, the cup in front of me was empty, but it had a bit of residue at the bottom, so it looked like someone had just freshly drank whatever was in there. And that's when Jamie looked at me and said, I hope you didn't drink the tea. And I looked at him confused and like, what are you talking about? And Jamie told me that that was a story that his father and mother used to tell him when he was younger to scare him, but he never knew that it was real. That his parents used to say that it was a way to deter him from talking to strangers, and that the moral of the story was that you never stay for tea. And that's what I did. I stayed for tea. So I sat there wondering if what happened last night was real, if I hallucinated it, or if I was sleepwalking. But one thing was for sure, one thing was for certain. The cup in front of me was empty, and the other two cups were not. So it looks like I did indeed stay for tea.